Hi, welcome to Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, thanks for watching. Well, there's a lot of attention to the presidential race in Pennsylvania and, of course, to the hot U.S. Senate race, but do you know there are 3 other statewide officials to be elected, and they are very important? And then Brad Bumsted from the Tribune-Review will join us for a little legislative update, Pennsylvania politics and government, in depth and in detail. And guess what? It all starts right now.
This is Pennsylvania Newsmakers, a fast-paced, unrehearsed weekly discussion with and about the leaders who shape your world. And now, here's your host.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Well, there's been a ton of attention to the presidential race and to the U.S. Senate race between challenger Tom Smith, who obviously is running against Bob Casey, but we have 3 extremely important elections in the state. Not a lot of press about it. We'll hear more about it. You're going to hear first about it on this program, however. Joining me, as often is the case, for our All-Star Business Roundtable is Fred Anton. He's the CEO from the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. And Sam Denisco, he's the VP of Government Affairs with the Pennsylvania Chamber of Commerce, of Business and Industry. In Lancaster, it's Commerce. You know, you got a little different names going everywhere. All right, Fred, you'll correct me. We have 3 important offices coming up. And you know, because you've been around this Capitol for a long time, these are very important offices: Attorney General, Auditor General, and State Treasurer. Why should the voters care about this?
Well, they should care about it because the Attorney General particularly has a very, very powerful role in state government, and he has a lot of discretion in bringing prosecutions. We see that. A
lot of lawmakers understand that, don't they?
Well, they do, with the number of lawmakers that have gone to jail, and particularly the Penn State situation with the Attorney General's report. And the focus of the Attorney General's report could arguably be why Penn State's in such serious trouble. And if the Attorney General decides to focus on you for one reason or another.
Not me, I hope.
I hope not me either.
Not you, and not Sam, right?
It is a very, very important election.
Now let's go. Auditor General. We've had Auditor Generals on this program. The role of the Auditor General, what?
Well, they all have 3 unique roles. You know, as Fred stated, the Attorney General, Auditor General, and Treasurer have their traditional roles that they have, whether the Treasurer is approving receipts or being tax appeals, Attorney General and Consumer Protection and other legal matters representing the Commonwealth in the courts. And the Auditor General...
hugely important, man, does those... Go ahead, finish the song.
Exactly. But a lot of times we see the row offices interjecting themselves in public policy, and that's very important for the business community.
Yeah, the Auditor General, I mean, we've had a bunch of them, and look, I want to ask Fred in a minute about how they're stepping stones to the governorship and to other offices. We know that to be the case. But the Auditor General gets in, does these audits, looks at the books, looks for fraud, looks for all sorts of ways in which the Commonwealth's money is not being spent properly. And, you know, I'm not being partisan about this, but there isn't any doubt Jack Wagner, the current Auditor General, has really done, I think, a bang-up job getting into a lot of various programs and talking about fraud and waste, and that's an important function. That needs to be done. I think as a representative of the business community, you would agree with that.
Sure. We're as a representative of the business community, we're always looking at reports that are coming out that are identifying holes, if you will, or fraud, waste, and abuse in the Department of Public Welfare, or if programs are not being administered properly, or where there could be streamlining and more transparency.
Right.
Again, that all goes to the bottom line, and where we can save on the bottom line, it's a better Commonwealth for our business leaders.
All right, Fred, not arguably, and again, we're not suggesting, as we just pointed out, these other 2 offices aren't important. They're critically important, we agree. But for some reason, the Attorney General election always sort of takes, has an added primacy, again, rightly or wrongly. And we've had in this state a kind of odd situation since the Attorney General's post was made elective in 1980. Let's talk about that.
But, speaking of why the Attorney General's position is so important, not only in Pennsylvania, but in other states, it's been a stepping stone to higher office. Now, Mike Fisher, who ran for governor, Tom Corbett, who is governor. Tom Corbett became governor as a result of his electoral success in running successfully 2 times for Attorney General and running well when the top of the ticket was won by Democrats.
And the Bonusgate investigation, as you pointed out, which led to those criminal charges against lawmakers, ex-lawmakers, and staffers, and public corruption charges.
And look at other states who look at Eliot Spitzer and what he did with the Attorney General of New York. I mean, other than the mayors of Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, primarily the mayor of Philadelphia or some legislative leader, as Sam has pointed out, these 3-row offices, not only Attorney General, have an opportunity to get a lot of publicity on policy statements. And I agree with you. Jack Wagner has distinguished himself by thoughtful comments on state policy, not necessarily within the Auditor General's role, but on...
Correct. All right, we're going to run to a break. We're going to take a quick review of these offices. We think this is important in this run-up to the presidential and to the elections on November 6th. See, I almost got caught up in saying the presidential election. We'll be back in a moment.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the Pennsylvania Chamber of Business and Industry, the statewide voice of business. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by BetterSaferRoads.com. To voice your support for safer highways and less traffic congestion, visit BetterSaferRoads.com. And by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business.
Hi, we're chatting here with Fred Anton and Sam Denisco about the row offices, as we call. These are elections that are extremely important. They don't get a lot of attention. All right, Sam, Kathleen Kane, the Democrat from Lackawanna County, David Freed from Cumberland County. Freed is a current DA. Kathleen Kane is a former assistant DA. Both have a lot of experience. Close race. What's your crystal ball here?
Well, it looks right now that Kane has a slight advantage from all the polling that we have seen, and Kane does have the. She did go through a primary throughout the state that was pretty hotly contested with a former U.S. Congressman, Pat Murphy, against her. So they've been out there on the stump, if you will.
And they both have a lot of legal experience, not getting into the politics of it, but it's not as though neither candidate sort of comes from another venue, from another walk of life. They both have spent a good bit of time prosecuting
they're both
the bad guys.
Right.
All right, Fred, one other thing before we move on. No Democrat has been able to win this seat. Right?
That's correct.
Since 1980. What's that all about?
I don't know what that's all about. I really don't know what it's all about. I hope it continues. Maybe what it's all about is the vote in Philadelphia. They don't get to that on the...
Really?
I don't know.
Yeah, but how about this thesis? How about, I'll throw this out to you guys.
You try it.
Typically, over the course of much of Pennsylvania history, voters have been a little less reluctant to turn the prosecutorial position over to Democrats, because I think they have thought that Republicans will be tougher on crime. Earlier, polls sort of showed that in these low visibility elections. So I'm not quite sure, but I think, and you guys may disagree, we could, if the president does very well and we don't have as much ticket splitting, we could see a Democratic sweep. I'm not predicting it. I'm merely saying for the first time, Fred, they could sweep.
You're
going to disagree with me.
No, I'm not going to disagree with you. I'm going to agree. I'm going to say I think one of Kathleen Kane's advantages is she's a woman.
Right.
I think that if people don't know the candidates, if they're not high enough profile, and certainly Dave Freed is not a high-profile candidate, as Sam has said, as a result of that divisive primary with Pat Murphy. If anything, Kathleen Kane has a higher profile statewide, and people if they don't know the candidates, first they go, many of them, to party, and then
That's exactly
women
right.
particularly are inclined to go to gender.
Yeah.
And I think the gender
Could help.
situation here
Yep.
will help her. I really do.
The one other race is Rob McCord is an incumbent. In fact, he's the only incumbent seeking re-election. He won pretty handily. The poll does, the one poll that Public Policy did but it was back in May, I haven't seen any recent polling, shows that to be pretty close. But have you gotten heavily involved in that race at the Chamber?
The Chamber hasn't been heavily involved. And again, with all these pollings we do have, and we've talked about this before,
Right.
we look at the variable of the unknown, and with
Right.
these row offices, and again, McCord being an incumbent, being a player in the Democratic Party, he may carry the day. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but again, there's always that large unknown voter that again, like with Freed and Kane, especially with
State Treasurer, it's not an office that we typically would see with a lot of high profile. The Auditor General, as we pointed out, does these audits. They get a lot of attention. The Attorney General prosecutes somebody. Treasurer's a much more relatively low-key.
It's the least familiar row office from the standpoint of
That's a great
duties.
point.
He
Go ahead.
is very well connected
Yes, he
within
is.
the Democratic Party. He's been very skillful at raising funds, and he's thought by many insiders
key point.
to have a great future
Yeah.
and possibly will run for governor.
Yep.
Therefore, that gives him an edge, a substantial edge in my judgment.
That's a good point. All right, we're going to run to a break. When we come back, we're going to take a look at just a preview of some of the hot congressional races. Currently, there are 12 Republicans and I guess 6 Democrats because of the redistricting. 2 Democratic districts were put together. We'll take a look at a congressional preview after these words.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is brought to you by Pennsylvania Credit Union Association. Pennsylvania Credit Unions, where people are worth more than money. To find a credit union that is right for you, check out ibelong.org. And by the Energy Association of Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania's energy information source. This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by the State System of Higher Education, 14 state-owned universities. The state system is the largest provider of higher education in Pennsylvania. And by the Hospital and Health System Association of Pennsylvania, working towards a healthy Pennsylvania.
Hi, welcome back to the program. All right, Fred Anton, Republicans have 12 seats. There are 1 million more registered Democrats. The Democrats have 6. What are you looking for as a preview for the congressional elections in our state?
What I'm hoping for is that the Republicans will keep the 12 seats that they have and pick up one more seat in central western Pennsylvania, where let's see, Keith Rothfuss
out in the
is
west,
running against Mark
Critz.
Critz. Yes,
I really think, just as we've talked about, 12, you have 12-7, the Republicans have 12-6.
right.
1 million more Democrats. The president has a lead in the state as we speak, and you're going to pick up another seat. Is that a little wishful thinking? Now, you can be for him. That's okay, but that's a little wishful thinking, guys.
It is wishful thinking. I think they can hold. The Critz seat will be tough. Again, the hotly contested primary factor definitely comes into play, where organized labor played very hard for Critz and carried the day. So, not a lot of these seats.
Hold on. This is a seat in western Pennsylvania, by the way, that's in Cambria and Westmoreland and parts of Beaver and Allegheny County. It's a seat that was merged together when they did redistricting. It's the 12th congressional district for our viewers in the western part of the state. Go ahead, Sam.
Well, not a lot of these seats are slam dunks, and the incumbents are working very hard, especially in the northeast, southeast seats are probably pretty,
But Fred, you have you make a point about the swing voters in the swing part of the state, where there are lots of independents down in the southeast, where you think there's going to be a real challenge, particularly in 1 or 2 districts down there for the Republicans to hold, correct?
I do. I think the 6th district, where Jim Gerlach has been the long-time incumbent. I think the 7th district, where Pat Meehan is a first-termer and where the district has been strengthened substantially, but there are a lot of new voters. And I think the 8th district, where Mike Fitzpatrick is running against Kathy Brockler. Brookbar, and that is a seat that has swung back and forth between Republicans and Democrats. And I also think if Mitt Romney has any chance to win,
he's got to win the suburbs.
He's got to win the suburbs of Philadelphia, and I think those seats could be affected depending by the top of the ticket in those three counties. So
now, do you agree with Fred that probably the 8th, that's the one that we hear a lot about, that's the Bucks County seat, by the way, mostly Bucks County, a little bit of Upper Montgomery County has been put into the district. It's been rejiggered to make it a little more, is that the one seat that you folks are paying a good bit of attention to?
Yeah, we're paying attention to that seat, definitely. That was a good point, Fred. And the variable, again, with where the presidential and the ticket splitting and will the top of the ticket carry the day in other races? I'm not that convinced that'll happen, but again, there's some strong incumbents on strong policy issues that came out of D.C. over the past few years.
All right, we're about out of time. I'll give Fred the last word.
But remember, there are 5 districts, congressional districts, where the Republicans are first-termers. Now, I would expect, because those districts have been strengthened in the redistricting by the redistricting, but you don't know what will happen in those districts.
Because of the first one. Okay.
They could be in play.
Okay. Fred gets the last word. All right, Brad Bumsted's coming up. We're going to have a little legislative preview. They're back. They come back next week for a short session. Brad Bumsted will review when we return.
This broadcast of Pennsylvania Newsmakers is presented by Highmark Blue Shield, changing the way health plans work for business with a variety of plan options for employers and more choices for employees. Information is available at highmark.com. Have a greater hand in your company's health. And by the Pennsylvania Healthcare Association, the future of long-term care.
Hi, welcome back to the program. Well, Brad Bumsted from the Pittsburgh Tribune-Review joins me, as often is the case. All right, Brad, let's get to it. Big decision this past week by the Supreme Court of the state of Pennsylvania. They sent the voter ID law back to the one Commonwealth Court judge who's supposed to decide what they couldn't decide, which is whether or not there's a constitutional impairment, meaning that qualified voters might not be able to produce the proper photo ID. Bring us up to date on that.
In her dissenting opinion, Justice Deborah Todd said what the Supreme Court did was punt.
Good point.
And they threw this back to Judge Robert Simpson in the Commonwealth Court and said, you decide and you make sure that there is no voter disenfranchisement. And if you think there's going to be any, you have to issue a preliminary injunction. A lot of legal scholars we've talked to think, how can he possibly guarantee there won't be any disenfranchisement? So is he boxed in? Will he have any alternative? I mean, he can stand pat.
Right.
And then he could be overturned, or he could just issue an injunction.
Enjoin the law. But the point I've been making, and you tell me if I'm wrong, for 4 months, every reporter that I know and lots of independent analysts have been trying to figure out how much, quote, voter disenfranchisement will occur. Am I right or wrong about that?
You're right, and no one knows. It's been estimated between 89,000 and 1.4 million. Right. Those are the extremes. 89,000 comes from the Department of State and Carol Achel. But in fairness, Achel says 89,000, but that's people without PennDOT IDs.
Right.
We don't know how many of those people also have military IDs, university
Student
IDs.
Right.
Right. So we don't really know the number. Simpson didn't know it.
And we still don't know it, am I right?
Right.
And we may never know it.
Right, but he estimated it's on the lower end
of
1 to 2%, not the 7 or 8% others.
And we have something like 170 organizations by one media account that are out there trying to make sure that everybody has some form of ID, correct?
Yeah, one thing that's switched, that's changed since Simpson first ruled that the law could go forward, is that the groups that were fighting it, take like the Democratic Party, began a real effort to make sure their people do get IDs. Yeah. So you have the opponents working with the supporters to help get the IDs.
And this guy has until some date in early October.
October the 2nd.
And I mean, I think it's just an impossible task. Maybe I'm wrong. And it's not, I won't use the word unfair, but how can they ask this judge, one guy, to figure out what we haven't been able to figure out, and folks like you who've written all these stories and done all these investigations couldn't do for 4 months?
Right, and no matter what he rules, if he were to say that I don't think there'll be any voter disenfranchisement, surely there'll be one person or more later who will say, I couldn't get my voter ID.
All right, let's turn our attention. I want to get to the presidential election if we have time, but obviously they're back for a relatively short session next week. You cover the legislature. You've been doing it for decades now. What's the state legislature and the governor in conjunction likely to do in the next, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before they then adjourn?
Yeah, it's a
recess,
total of maybe 8 session days.
Oh,
it's not like this is a long fall session, and the priorities are all over the map.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot gets done, except from the governor's perspective, laying the groundwork for next session to consider pension reform, I think is really a high priority with him. And that's trying to get a grip on the cost of public pensions.
The last figure I saw was $39 billion that both pension systems, school teachers and the public employees currently has. Is that about right?
I think that's correct. And the real point, though, is that even if they lessen the pensions for new employees, they can't really do anything about the legacy costs, which is really what's driving the financial problem for the state.
Yeah.
They can't go back and take pensions away from people. It's illegal.
It's a constitutional impairment. And so even moving forward, if they were to adjust pensions for new employees, it still leaves them with this huge debt, which I read somewhere is going to cost up to $1 billion out of the annual budget just to pay for the interest.
Yeah.
Am I close?
Yeah, you are close, and that's a real problem. I think you'll see movement toward that, but no action.
Yeah.
The top priority for the House, I spoke with Majority Leader Mike Turzai. He wants debt reduction. The Capital Redevelopment Assistance Act to put some curbs on that, claiming that there was abuse of that under Governor Rendell. Whether the Senate will do anything with it is unclear. One thing that could get through is right-to-know law revisions to apply to Penn State, Pitt, and the state-related.
Now explain this. We have about 50 seconds left, but that means that if folks like you and the media, others could, but you and the media request certain kinds of information, they're currently exempt from that law. Is that correct?
They are, and Penn State over the years had lobbied to be exempt. And lawmakers said, fine, you don't have to be under the right-to-know law. Yet the state-owned universities,
have to comply,
Millersville, Shippensburg, and California all have to comply. Penn State doesn't.
All right, thanks for the great update. All right, we'll see you next week for another edition of Pennsylvania Newsmakers, and as always, stay well.